Welcome. My name is Martha Crago, and I'm the Vice Principal of Research and Innovation at McGill University in Canada. And it's my great pleasure to be the moderator of today's discussion. It's a discussion about solving future crises through collaboration. And to help us think through some of the issues about this important topic, we have some wonderful speakers. Dr. Peter Gluckman, who is the President-elect of the International Science Council and was the former New Zealand Chief Science Advisor. We have Dr. Fleming Krim, Chief Operating Officer at the National Science Foundation. And we have Dr. Von Terekian, who is the Executive Director of Policy and Global Affairs at the National Academies. We'll also be joined by Dr. Mark Thompson, the Executive Chair of the Science and Technology Facilities Council of UK Research and Innovation, and Dr. Gelsomina Papalardo, who is the Director of the CNR Institute of Methodologies for Environmental Analysis at the National Research Council of Italy. They will be recorded separately. So let's get started with a first question here. How can large-scale collaborations be leveraged to tackle predictable future crises that may be another pandemic, heaven forbid, or climate change crises? So, Peter Gluckman, can I call on you to get us started on this one?
Well, I think the issue of collaboration is one of how do we make sure the global north and the global south work together on these critical issues. And that requires the funders and the people that set the mandates for the funders to recognize that there's unequal access to capacities. And therefore, the extent to which funders set their own priorities rather than working together to combine their priorities and get mutual agreement on what does need to be done at a global level or regional level, as opposed to what's in direct national interest, is, I think, the fundamental issue here. I think we saw that in the way the early stages of the pandemic played out. I think we're seeing it now in other aspects, not so much in the science, but in the application of the science. And I think the crying out need is for some initiatives that get the funders to agree to work together on the priorities rather than each setting their own priorities independent of each other.
Okay, Fleming Krim, what do you think about this?
Well, I think that that the comment about setting priorities is of course right at the heart of what we're thinking about doing. And the notion that people would let someone else set their priorities, of course, doesn't make people happy. But Peter said just the right thing. We have to talk with each other about setting priorities. For example, think of as the question asks, predictable future crises. They tend to be global. And it's much harder to stand up a response when you haven't been in communication. So the internationalization of science is a fact of life, the globalization of science. And if we are wise, we will put significant effort into talking with each other to understand the priorities of each of the participants and to identify where we make common cause. COVID-19 drove us to make common cause very suddenly and very dramatically. And look at all the resources, that computational resources, laboratory resources that came to bear. But it would be better if we had been talking with each other, if not necessarily about a pandemic, about such predictable issues as climate change, so that we have both communication and some common assumptions, common ground as we begin.
And how does that look from the National Science Foundation perspective, Dr. Terekian? I think you got.
Yeah, I'm muted because I'm not the National Science Foundation. That's Dr. Krim. But,
oh, sorry.
Yeah, but so I'm sure he's well equipped to talk about that, because I know that that NSF is thinking a lot about this in a number of their programs. But let me dovetail off of what my two colleagues have said, because I think it's actually really critical that you don't build a firehouse when there's a fire. It doesn't work that way. And we're seeing what happens when you try to put these things together in sort of literally on the fly. That idea of developing not only communication, but real life collaboration, so that people have gotten the trust with one another to understand how they work, but also where the gaps are. I mean, we all think about somehow a global scientific community, and that's true. But the reality is that within those global scientific communities, there are different norms, there are different standards, there are different cultures. And so being able to bring together communities of science, communities of science policy in ways that can help understand where those gaps are will ultimately be critical to how we're going to develop the approaches going forward when there is a major crisis or when there is an anticipation of crisis. So I would say that one of the things we need to always think about is how do we keep that conversation going, but also being able to go to some of the harder questions. I think, and Peter was beginning to get towards them with, I think, his initial sort of provocative comments, that how do countries balance global interest with national interest? And being able to understand how those different dynamics play is fundamentally critical to determining how that international scientific community can operate in that space.
Okay, now what if we unpackage this and think about acute crises as opposed to long-term challenges? So an acute one, you'd have less time to put it all into place. So Fleming Krim, can I go back to you and ask you how you would see an acute crisis versus a long-term challenge?
So you've actually framed it in exactly the right way, in that an acute crisis. This is the fire that Vaughn's talking about, and for an acute crisis, it's clearly, to use this popular phrase, all hands on deck, and in fact, depending on how people perceive the severity of the crisis, the response can be more or less effective. Now, think of the structures that we use to prepare for the two different events. One is, Vaughn, I'm gonna push your analogy if you don't mind. One is building the firehouse and equipping it. The other is being able to respond to the alarm. So if you think about things like broad sustained sensor networks or something, that is what sets us up to respond to a long-term or a chronic issue. Climate change is the one that comes to everybody's mind. Responding to an acute crisis takes a different approach. Now, I'm not going to so much talk about an acute crisis like the pandemic, but let's think of a local natural disaster or an event that is going to require data and information. Having flexible mobile systems that can allow us to actually bring resources to bear. And I'm now talking about data generating resources, research resources, bring those to bear in response to the acute crisis is what we will need. So in a way, those two things are very complementary. Say, long-term monitoring and sensor networks, but also mobile flexible networks that could be brought to bear on a particular crisis. Now you can take that and just write it large, in that you can think about computing facilities that can be redirected toward a particular issue. I've talked about sensors. You can think about laboratory research. It could be redirected toward a particular issue. There are whole collections of flexible resources that really are simply a different version of the resources we use for long-term support.
I believe a former colleague of yours, Rita Caldwell, wrote a nice little booklet called Science in a Time of Crisis. And
Yes,
it's a very interesting read.
Yes, Rita is a forceful woman with lots of good ideas, so I agree.
Peter Gluckman, have you got a way to think about the acute versus the long-term challenge?
Well, I think actually they require the same infrastructure as already been suggested. And that infrastructure, I think, that matters is the communication between the policymakers in science, communication between the science funders, and the communication between people who are knowledge brokers, et cetera, et cetera. And I think that what we don't have is that communication really as effective and strategic as it could be. And I think that that if we, I found early on in the pandemic, the International Network for Government Science Advice, which I was chairing, was having to introduce Government Advisor 1 in one country to Government Advisor 2 in another country because they didn't know how to reach out to each other. And I think that even just that the basis of getting the scientific and the science policy and the science fundamental community to have that ability to work together strategically, share ideas, know each other, is at the heart of the issue. We've got a couple of good examples out there, like the Global Research Alliance on agricultural greenhouse gases, where countries have agreed how to work with each other to identify priorities and then do their bit of their contribution to the international effort. There are efforts out there that do that, but I think it needs to be much more systematic. I think that's where the International Science Council has a role in bringing the science community together, the Global Forum of Funders, the Global Research Council, and bringing the funders together. But I also think there's a need broader than that, because ultimately the funders are responsible to their political masters, and therefore I think there's a need at the moment which is not met by the multilateral system, for how the multilateral system looks at global science priorities. And that's what we've seen, is a lot of duplicative activity, but no real meat in the sandwich around, for instance, the science that's needed, the knowledge gaps Vaughan talked about with the Sustainable Development Goals or the Human Development Program. And so I think there is a need to look at the international multilateral science policy system to see if we could actually strengthen a way of working together better.
Okay, Dr. Turekian, now that I'm clear that you're the Executive Director of Policy and Global Affairs, how do you see this, the kinds of things that Dr. Gluckman was talking about?
Yeah, I think the points that are made are, again, right on in terms of even multitasking or multi-use of sensors and that science policy interface. And I guess I would look at it from a frame of the acute stage of a problem, whether it's the acute problem itself or whether it's an acute problem or it's an acute stage of the problem, and the more chronic stage actually have very different responses, in no small part because the way in which that information is delivered has to be different. And the way in which the data are robust enough to be able to make conclusions are different. One of the things we saw very early on with COVID, and we see this very early on with many disasters that come up, is that there's a demand for instantaneous advice, but the pace at which the science is developing is slower than the pace with which the political process needs the advice. And so that disconnect is very tricky, right? We don't have data originally on transmission, whether masks actually stop transmission. We can build on some studies that might exist, but we don't yet have the data yet at the start of the crisis. Over time, you begin to develop that, and that becomes the foundation for the next level of information you get as you get to a more of a chronic stage, either of a certain disease or certain situation, or a chronic situation itself. And so I think we have to look at the timeframes, as this question asks, in a way that really does begin to think about that interface. What it does, I think, is it actually puts more pressure in the acute stage on both the scientists and the policy people to understand what the question is that needs to be asked and what the question is that's being asked, and the understanding and the ability to communicate why you actually have uncertainty someplace. Because you can't just sit there with a hubris that says, I know the answer. Here it is, it's 7. You have to be able to communicate that in a way, and that takes training. So in some ways, one of the things I think we have to do a good job of, both for near-term and long-term sort of science-based or science-underpinned disasters, are to better equip the scientific community to understand how to enter into that interface in a way that's connected to what the decision-making is going to be.
Okay, I think Fleming Krim wants to add something in here.
Well, I'm going to resonate with what Vaughn is saying, and he can give you examples of efforts that NASM made, that the National Academies made, to stand up a conversation of that sort during COVID-19. And NSF funded part of it. A number of people funded it, but it was not a simple process. And because we hadn't, in a way, had that much practice, it wasn't necessarily something that we did as well initially as we could have. And something that Peter touched on and at which Vaughn hinted has to do with having conversations before, having relationships, knowing people. So I think that we can get tired of a policy forum in which people get together and chat, okay? But it does have a virtue, it builds relationships. So you've got to balance those two things off. It's got to be, the game's got to be worth the candle, right? The conversation has to be worth having. But in a way, what you're doing is preparing for when those conversations are going to really count. And so I think that all of us are responsible for cultivating those relationships and those partnerships. Now, partnerships can be a tangible way of interacting and getting to know each other that then you can draw on when the crisis comes. So I think international partnerships are really something that offer a lot of opportunities, not just partnerships between or among funding agencies, but involving industries, involving nonprofits, involving professional societies. The more folks we can get, not just at the table for the conversation, but really engaged in the partnership, the more resources they're going to have, the more sort of connection and intellectual resources they're going to have to really deal with the acute crisis.
Okay, Dr. Gluckman.
Well, there's 2 points I want to make, and they're quite separate. One picks off the last comment made, and that is Global North, Global South. Remember, the bulk of science funding is owned by agencies and foundations that are based in the G20 countries. And yet many of these existential crises emerge or have their greatest impact and flow on to the other 174 countries in the world. And therefore, I think one of the issues that we do need to work through in international science is, when is the international science being done for the benefit, if you like, of the global commons, and when is it being done for the benefit of the donor country? And I think there's a sensitivity there that has to be worked through, which I do not think is worked through well at the present time. I want to make an entirely separate comment, which is, in my experience over the last year dealing with various aspects of the COVID pandemic in multiple countries, and that is the issue of risk understanding, the science of risk communication, and the science particularly of risk perception by decision makers and policy makers. Vaughan raised the issue of uncertainty and how you communicate knowledge in the presence of uncertainty, which is inevitable in an early stage of a crisis. But what we've seen in this pandemic, and what we've seen, honestly, if we look at climate change, is despite a lot of evidence of potential risk and potential events, the ability of that to have been absorbed by the policy community, and in some cases by the science community or the science funding community, has not been there. And therefore, I think there's a major issue globally and nationally in terms of risk perception and how that plays into priority setting. And while I think that sounds like an off-piste comment, I think it's at the heart of how the science community operates with the policy community to deal with risks as they will evolve. I think it's the fundamental issue. We saw lots of warnings about zoonotic pandemics emerging globally, with few exceptions. Risk that was not incorporated into thinking by either the policy or the science community.
All right, now from my vantage point, I'm really interested in funding models and helping my researchers get funding. So what kind of funding models do we need in a time of, well, think to the future? if we were to do something for future global crisis, what funding models and what kinds of mandates and incentives could funding organizations put into place, or what ones need to be changed? So Fleming, you're in one of those funding organizations, so maybe you want to start this off.
Well, we get pretty comfortable with our mechanisms. And one of the things that the new director of the National Science Foundation, he's been there not quite a year, Sethyaraman Pachanathan, talks about is thinking about how we do things differently. Now, in some cases, we need authorities or leave to do things differently. Sometimes we need will to do things differently. Also, the kind of problem you're looking at has a lot to do with what kind of approach you could take. Our competitive merit review has funded a tremendous amount of great science. It's also been a method by which we have funded large facilities, funded large extensive networks. There's a lot of success there. I'm going to go back to something I said before, not just because it's one of the themes at the National Science Foundation now, but because I really believe it's important. And I think it relates to this conversation about international connections, and that has to do with partnerships. To make a partnership work, everybody has to be bringing something to it. And sometimes it's people bringing funding. Often it's somebody bringing funding, somebody bringing expertise, somebody bringing a facility. And sometimes it is people having a location or a natural resource that's particularly suited. So I think that I do not think that we need drastically different ways of funding things, but I'm going to be interested in what Peter and Vaughn have to say about this. But I do think that we need to think about being nimble and being agile. One of the conversations that we are having a lot is what small changes can we make in the way we do things that makes us faster, makes us more agile. The science we're funding often takes a long time to pay off. So it isn't just talking about moving faster on doing the science, it's moving faster on taking the next step after you've done the science. It's being able to get the science funded more quickly. So we're spending a lot of time thinking about all that. I don't have a magic bullet to point to, but I do think that we need to concentrate on how we connect to our communities and have them ready to respond when a need comes along. And that's not always our standard write a proposal and get it funded. Real quickly, let me mention that when COVID-19 came along, we used a mechanism at the National Science Foundation called RAPIDS. It's a process by which someone can send in a proposal of a few pages to do research that needs to be done right now because of some transitory phenomenon, in this case, COVID. And we funded up to awards of up to $250,000. And we funded many hundreds of those because we had the way to respond quickly, and we turned those around fast.
Hey, if you were going to give him advice about what a funder should do, what would it be, Vaughn?
First of all, I think I would hardly be in the position to give advice on such things. The National Science Foundation gets advice from many different places, including the academies on these different activities. So far be it from me to be the one to individually give advice. What I will do, though, is highlight something, and it actually touches on something Peter mentioned earlier on the North-South issue, about one of the most innovative programs that NSF is part of, that the academies has been fortunate to be engaged in and helping with, which is something called the peer network. So one of the big challenges that we have in the United States in funding is, of course, and not uniquely to the United States, and I think Peter alluded to it at the start, is that there's always going to be pressure for setting the priorities based upon national political systems or national funding priorities. But one of the things that we obviously see is that science is, and not just science in crisis, science generally, building the body of knowledge, is a universal or global activity. And so what are the really innovative mechanisms to build those connections? Well, one of them is called this peer program, where the National Science Foundation is funding, and other agencies, NIH in the health space, are funding the top scientists and the research being done maybe by the US-based researcher and PI. But USAID, our development agency, then piggybacks on top of that with funding that they can put towards the principal investigator in the country where the USAID has a mission. So now what you've done is you've actually done two things. You've gotten the extremely high caliber science, which has gone through the NSF rigor of review, that allows for that science to look at the major issues, and then, and Fleming alluded to it, then partnering or twinning with a researcher who has access, maybe not to funds, but to facilities, to samples, to indigenous knowledge, to all sorts of issues in countries which don't necessarily have the funding regimes. And you've coupled that with USAID, which is a development agency in the US, their funding to fund that PI. So what you've built is in fact that partnership, which allows for the collaborations. You've now started to establish these wonderful networks that can be activated, as we've seen around PEER, which is the program, which we've seen around things like cervical cancer or other issues, these networks that can be activated. But you've also developed an ability to bring together and knit together a scientific community. These are really innovative forms of funding. I would imagine over the long term, we should look at, and I'm sure Fleming and the new NSF director are there ways to work those types of partnerships with not just US funding agencies, but with philanthropies and maybe even the private sector, so that we can really find ways to elevate and magnify the impact of the tremendous work that NSF does into other domains.
Can I follow up on what Vaughn
Yeah,
said before
sure.
Peter speaks, because it'll be brief and it follows right on. The people who provide NSF funding, that is the taxpayers, through their representatives, have said, I don't want you, NSF, funding researchers in other countries. So what we do is we fund our part, they fund their part, and then what Vaughn was talking about is the mechanism where part of the government that is designed to reach out and provide funding in that area steps in and allows us to build that connection and that partnership. It's really an important mechanism. And I'll very quickly say, a partnership like that needs to be something, as I said earlier, where both sides win and both sides need something. You can't fly in and say, oh, I like your ecological resource, let me use it. You have to come in as a true partner.
Okay, Peter, this is really interesting to me, this layered approach.
Well, I do think we need some disruptive change in the international science funding arrangements. I do think that it's not so much for doing the projects, which have just been talked about more by Fleming. It's again about agreeing on what needs to be done to meet the issues of the global commons. And I think what I'm seeing at the moment is a lot of duplicative, high-level talking by scientists on roadmaps for this and the SDGs, or roadmaps on this and the SDGs, but that's dislocated from the funding mechanism discussions. And I think we have, and I think there are areas of science where it does need to be agreed what are the missions that need to be achieved for the global commons. And that it still comes back to how it's done by the ways that Fleming's just been talked about. But we don't have a mechanism that actually gets a consensus on what are the big issues that need to be addressed on the global commons, so they can be taken back to foundations, public and private sector, and so forth. I think that, you know, we've seen with DARPA type models, and I think the NSF has moved in that direction with the project that Fleming talked about, the possibility of how you acutely create mission-led approaches to solve a problem, even if it takes time. I can think of, and I don't think these global mechanisms need to be expensive, but they do need global coordination and global funding. Let me give you an example. In about 2009, New Zealand recognized that there was a fundamental issue about greenhouse gas emissions in agriculture. 22% of greenhouse gas emissions were produced from agriculture, and yet we had to both increase in the world food production because of food security issues, but reduce greenhouse gas emissions from agriculture. Now that's a huge bucket of issues, but they're not issues that tend to get to the top of any one agenda of a funding agency, which tends to be focused in many cases in other directions. So New Zealand, with the help of the US and Canada, brought together what was called the Global Research Alliance on Agricultural Greenhouse Gas Emissions. It's run by one diplomat, not by a whole agency, but involves 66 countries in coordinated research. Again, in the model of some countries have money, some have resources, to do work which is aimed at reducing greenhouse gases emissions in agriculture. And they've made enormous progress in a number of areas which otherwise would not have been addressed. For example, methane production from wet rice paddies is an enormous contributor to global methane production. Clearly, ruminant production of methane is a huge issue. Again, these could not have been dealt with by any one country alone. And yet the issue would not have been seen by any one country alone, except for New Zealand because of its unusual situation, as being the priority. And so there are models out there for relatively little funding where you can get both the policy makers and the scientists to agree what needs to be achieved on the global commons.
Yeah, Peter, I would agree, and I think that's actually it's a great model. I think one of the challenges is that in the research funding space, the hardest money to get is actually the glue money that allows for these things to take place, because it tends to be not focused on the research itself, but it's actually the facilitator money. It's not large sums of money, but it's the type of money that you actually need to be able to catalyze a lot of these activities. So if I were to be, maybe to get to your point, where one of the things I would like to see more of is a coordinated ability to get glue money into the system faster.
Exactly.
Because then that might then allow the larger sort of phalanx of the big funding that would come in to all the various places. But that glue money is so hard to get, and it can be equally burdensome to try to get it.
I think that's what's needed. I mean, I really do believe that it's not about creating a big global fund or anything like that. But I do think that there is a need for glue money that allows the research funding community, the research policy community, and organizations like the Inter-Academy Panel and the Internet Science Council to work together on identifying the areas in which mission-led research would be constructively advantageous, either for fast or slow moving risks.
So can I ask
Yes,
Peter?
you get to jump in because you're the funder.
I want to ask Peter a question about the global commons, because we all know about the tragedy of the commons, and science, and Bill Press has written about this, as have a number of other people. Science, if you look at the progress of science and positive outcomes, it really has worked well when there was some reason that you could support the commons. Either one country was dominant and got all the benefits, so it was happy to support the commons, or there were other reasons for supporting the commons. But what are our motivations for supporting the global commons? And I think your glue money is a good point to make people recognize the issues that are affecting the global commons. But I'd like to hear you talk about that a little bit, if you don't mind.
Well, I think it comes back to my earlier comment, Fleming, about risk. I mean, I think that we, as in our lives, can all identify a set of existential risks that are likely to happen in some way. Now, different countries will have a different level of interest in some. All countries should have an interest, for instance, in climate change. All countries should have an interest in pandemic risk. But there are other risks of loss of social cohesion, risks of the global mental health burden, et cetera, et cetera. within the sustainability agenda, there's obviously risks around water security, food security, et cetera, Many of these have a large social science component of it, and yet most of the international science has been built around the physical, natural sciences, the big infrastructures like CERN or the Square Kilometre Array or so forth. And I think we do need to think through with sensitivity to the issues that Vaughan raised before of Indigenous knowledge, different cultural perceptions, to understand the importance, the criticality of social science to addressing many of the issues ahead. If you think about climate change, many of the issues ahead around managing that risk, as we saw equally in the pandemic, came down to individual choices by individual people as to how they will act in a particular situation, whether they will whether they'll walk rather than take the car, whether they'll wear a mask or not wear a mask. This is social science impacting on the global risk. And so I think that there are lots of things here, but they come down to actually, I think, a global, again, I don't want to create a monster. I'm interested in creating the communication, which I think organizations like the one that I'm involved with can play a major role in actually making sure that the transdisciplinary approaches that are needed, not just within the science community, but linking through both the national and particularly to the multilateral system, are important. I find it extraordinary, for example, that we are 15 months into the pandemic. The United Nations General Assembly has not met at a high level to discuss the pandemic. The Security Council has not met to discuss the pandemic. There have been clearly issues in the major agency associated with managing the pandemic. And yet those issues which involve political science, social science, risk science, have not been brought together by the scientific community with the policy community so we do it better next time.
Well, for a social scientist's ears, this is music. So if you think about organizations, how do you create resilient organizations for collaboration? Things that endure, things that are there, that are focused on the kinds of collaborations needed in a crisis situation.
It comes down to people knowing each other, as we've said repeatedly. If the networks don't exist, both formally and informally, things can't happen. And we've seen, and Vaughan and I are both, if you like, the patrons of what's called the Foreign Minister's Science and Technology Advisory Network. And that is an entirely informal network of about 40 countries, science advisors or equivalents to their foreign ministries, or diplomats with responsibilities for science. And in the last year, that informal network has been extraordinarily valuable, both in terms of individual countries managing the pandemic, but also in building thought which is flowing through to some of the discussions that will be going on in the next 2 weeks in Geneva about the future of of WHO. So I think I'm answering your question indirectly, but I think at the end of the day, Martha, it comes down to two things. People knowing each other and trusting each other because they've had lots of interactions. They may have different missions because of who they work for, but it doesn't mean that they can't trust and talk to each other. It also means that the institutions have multiple levels of communication. And we've seen that emerge in this last year in some quite interesting ways. So, for example, we've had, I mean, if you look at how the science community has been acting in the last few months over thinking ahead of the long-term issues of the pandemic emergence, there's a lot of cooperation between countries in the science community that you may not see in the public media.
I think that's right. The other thing I would add in is that resilient institutions constantly have to be innovative. I think we think of institutions themselves as being these sort of monolithic organizations that sit there. And if we've learned really nothing over the last maybe decade, it's the importance of being of promoting an innovative culture within the institutions themselves. That it doesn't guarantee resilience, but without it, you can't be resilient. The system is changing too quickly. And that means you actually have to give the empower people to be a little bit innovative and a little bit risky, and encourage that in a way that you sort of approach that institution. The other piece is, I think it gets to the issue that we also have to recognize that there are issues that will inherently be very political. Political issues themselves have a much faster turnover. There's almost less of a resilience of the institutions when they're focused only on the political. It's those institutions that build those broad layers of trust with other institutions that actually are resilient. So, Peter mentioned, some of these activities. Well, there's always going to be the political part of it. And those are going to sort of flame in and out. But it's the underlying areas of cooperation and collaboration that you build the scaffolding that makes that not only that institution resilient, but that partner resilient or partnership resilient.
And how about organizations that are really technically, the technical side of things, whether it's access, data, security, infrastructure?
Data was what I wanted to talk about, because I think that one of the things that can knit people together, in addition to Peter's blue funding, is access to coordinated, curated, and validated data. And open data platforms are a way that people connect to each other and respond to these exigencies. So I believe that we're talking about that a lot. We're only beginning to execute on it. There are lots of data out there now, but they need to be curated, which costs money and takes commitment, and they need to be validated. They need to be good data. And so, I believe that will bind us together as diverse scientific communities. I really think that's important. And let me very quickly go back to the point of risks and resiliency. An organization needs to be innovative, as Vaughn said, and to be innovative, it has to try new things. Some of them won't work, and it has to say, okay, that didn't work, I'll try something else. And we talk about not being risk adverse, but if you're not risk adverse, you're going to fail sometime. And we can't be in an environment where failure is seen as something that means, oh, that's a terrible mistake. It just means we tried that one and it didn't work. And I don't think we have that mindset. What's we? I think that particularly if times are tough, people become very conservative about risk. But when people have to answer to a number of masters or a number of interrogators that have very different agendas, it's easy to be risk averse. We have to work every day at the National Science Foundation to not be risk averse.
I think that's right. I think and it's harder the more established an institution is, the harder that is to do. I do want to build on the data piece because I think this is a critical issue as more and more of the ways that we're going to communicate with each other scientifically and even how we're going to respond are going to be built around data. These are huge issues, and in fact, the academies did a report a number of years ago on this idea of open data by design, and really it touches on a number of the topics that Fleming spoke to. That you can't just sort of walk your way into this open data system. There actually are, as you say, curating, validating, all these things that have to come through, and especially when you have multiple partners and multiple vectors of those data coming in, not just one country or not one agency which has data in certain ways, but even when you're getting outside of the public sector into the private sector data. So we have to build in resilient data systems, which means training new people how to be able to handle data in a way. So it's a very multi-pronged thing. I mean, we're going to need to have a whole sort of, I think, graduate training on how we think about new graduate students, how they think about when they become researchers, how they are thinking about open data in their field, and how they design their experiments with open data in mind. And that's going to be an enormously different way of training.
Peter.
I agree fully with what's been said about the importance of open data and the potential that data sharing has to create a much more, to maintain those relationships and build those relationships. But there are a couple of issues. Fleming's raised one, which is a big elephant in the room, which is cost and ownership and management and ethics and a whole lot of related issues in there, which I do not think we've grasped well. There are some international organizations like CoData that are starting to think about it, but it's a lot more complex. And there's one domain that it worries me a lot, coming from a medical science background, and that is the whole issues of social license. I think once you start to deal with people's data across cultures, how it will be interpreted, how it will be read, the range of issues which do not exist in the same way if you're dealing with, say, geophysical data are enormous. And I do think it's a priority to work through some of the issues, because at the end of the day, we're beyond the business of having the geophysical over here and the social science over there. It's increasingly coming into one space. And we need to think through those issues proactively and with appropriate engagement with the people who are very concerned. You're in Canada, Martha, I'm in New Zealand. They're both countries with large, appropriately concerned and vocal Indigenous peoples. And within that, the issues of how data is managed, and in both cases, not just about them or their health or whatever, it's also about their environment, because they have different perceptions and beliefs about their relationship to their land, their rivers, their mountains, and so forth. We need to be much more sensitive if we're going to be successful in open data and thinking through the transcultural issues that surround it.
All right, this is, I think, extremely important for us. We don't have a lot of time left, but I do want to ask this question about priorities. Priorities in a time of crisis. Who gives input into them, and who makes the decisions?
You know, there's a lot of sausage making that goes on in setting any collection of priorities. And then when a crisis comes, you've got to make the sausage very, very fast. And a lot of the sort of the minuet of sausage making that we have developed, if that's not too tortured, is not fast. And people, you know, people who are trying to slow things down will say, oh, no, you got to be more careful, you're going to waste money. And other people will say, what do you mean the house is on fire? To go back to the original metaphor, we've got to find a hose. And I really think that, to go back to something that came from the very beginning of this discussion, we need to have structures in place so that when it's time to respond adroitly, we can do it. And it's important, but doesn't always feel urgent. And there aren't always drivers to be doing that. And so Peter has been talking about, how do we create those drivers? And I think that's a really important issue. Okay.
Somebody else want to talk about who makes the decisions?
Well, I think we come back to the point that Vaughan and I have talked about many, many times over many years of friendship and interaction. And that is about strengthening the relationship between the science community and the policy community. Now, there's many ways that can be done. And in some countries, it's much more established. In all three of our countries, it's certainly more established than it is in many other countries. But I sit there with amazement that in many countries, ad hoc mechanisms had to be developed right in the middle of the pandemic, rather than being pre-existing science advisory mechanisms, pre-existing mechanisms for evidence synthesis, and then, which is one mechanism which often lies with academies and organizations like that, and then the evidence of knowledge brokerage, transmitting that knowledge to the decision makers. And it worries me now immensely that 15 months into the pandemic, very few countries are taking the lesson from that and thinking through how do they strengthen their evidence synthesis and evidence brokerage systems, so that the next time round, whether it's advising a government on how to manage or giving input into a science funder or a Ministry of Science on what they should do, the systems we're not the system. We need to build the systems now for the next time, rather than waiting for longer.
Okay, Vaughn.
No, I would agree with that. I think that we have to, those systems need to be built and they need to be practiced, and recognizing that you're not going to repeat what you have now. So they've got to be adaptable, but it's the practice of how you go through this and how do you develop the types of interactions. And again, it comes down to this, Peter used the word knowledge brokerage. I used to be a science advisor, and the most important thing I could do was not only translate the science to the policymaker, but translate the policy to the science maker. And that is a very hard situation to be in. And it takes time to develop those skills. And I don't know that I was any good at it, but I know that that's something that is much more needed. That ability to translate back to the people producing what the nature of the question is, in a way that they can then activate their networks and do the types of science needed to answer that question.
Okay, Peter Gluckman, and then I'm going to tell you a story from March of 2020 of my own.
Let me just give you a simple question. How many countries in the world are prepared and understand the issues associated with a massive solar flare, which is inevitable to occur in the next few years at some point? And in a digital age, it will be far, if it's the size of the Carrington event, it could do an untold damage and undermine resilience. In New Zealand 7 years ago, nobody knew what a solar flare was in the whole administrative process. I suspect that's common, a massive solar flare and its impact. I suspect that's common around the world. We take obvious existential risks, which the scientific community understands will happen. It's not that it may happen, it will happen. Have we actually prepared for it? Have we thought through how, because in a globalized world with a digital infrastructure, these issues are going to be totally different to what they were in 1859 when the last big event occurred.
Okay, in March,
No, I don't know how many of you have watched the British series Cobra. Solar flare is one of the catastrophic events that drives terrible political issues. And I don't think we would have had that as a topic, as you say, a decade ago.
all right, I'll tell you what I thought of one day in March of 2020. I live near where there's a hospital, and I spent the day hearing ambulances bring people to the hospital, presumably with a lot of them with COVID. And so I thought to myself, we need some kind of strategic innovation, research, emergency network. And I invented the acronym SIREN. And I thought it reminded me of the Army Corps of Engineers in the United States. Something that is ready for when it happens. Something where we've made the partnerships, the collaborations, put in place the things that you bring out in the time of an emergency. So I lend you all the acronym because I thought it was a great one that day. And I'm not sure we've put in place anything like this for the future in Canada, but I do think the world needs to think about what strategic research and innovation emergency networks and collaborations and ways of connecting in times of crisis. So I want to thank you all for this. This was a wonderful discussion. It will be enlarged by 2 more people that I'll be speaking with next week, and that will be integrated into this session. So probably worth listening to again. I want to do that. So once again, from everywhere that you came from, with all your wonderful advice and ideas, I think we've given people some food for thought.
Thank you so much.
Thank you. It's a pleasure. Thank you very much.
Gelsomina, can you address this first question then about how large-scale collaborations can be leveraged to tackle future crises, for instance, climate change crises?
Yes, I like this word collaborations. I think it's the real key word for the entire session and probably for the entire conference, I would say. Allow me, before answering to your question, to give a short introduction about what we are doing in Europe for research infrastructures. This introduction is necessary for me to try to clarify what we are talking about, to set the scene, and also to focus on your question, trying to answering in the best and the most effective and clear way, hopefully. We are talking about large research infrastructures, what we call research infrastructures of pan-European relevance, not the national or regional facilities. And what we are talking about here are the large research infrastructures which provide access to the scientific community at large, but also to the private sector. And this needs to be kept in mind. And then we need to consider ESFRI, the European Strategy Forum on Research Infrastructure. I don't want to introduce ESFRI here because I suppose it was already covered in other sessions, but it's important to mention that ESFRI was established to support a coherent strategy-led approach to policy making of research infrastructure in Europe, but also to facilitate multilateral initiatives leading to the better use and development of research infrastructure. So answering to your question for collaboration, I would say that the answer is already in ESFRI. The ESFRI arise are mainly funded by member states. We try to align themselves along the policies as developed by ESFRI. And one of the key messages at the moment from ESFRI, as reported in the ESFRI white paper published last year, Making Science Happen, is that European research infrastructures play a crucial role in Europe's ability to produce new knowledge and innovation, but also to try to help understand and tackle the environmental, societal, and economic challenges that we face. And those are the basis of the huge crisis that we can expect in the future. And we know that these challenges need a multidisciplinary approach, and in most cases needs to be handled at a global scale. So ESFRI is pushing for collaboration among the different areas across the different scientific domains, because we need to have this kind of approach to tackle the big challenges and to try to be prepared for future crises. We try what we can do. We don't know exactly the future, but we have already some sign. And our context is fixed already in the EU priorities. Those are political priorities which are related to the European Green Deal, an economy that works for people, a Europe fit for the digital age, protecting our European way of life, and a stronger Europe in the world, and a new push for European democracy. All those things are political priorities, but also can be translated in what we have in what we call as the European research area, that we need to broaden. To broaden here means to fit HERA to help achieve this kind of new ambitions and to accelerate the digital and ecological transformation that are needed to promote a more inclusive and fair research and innovation system, and to move from an approach of coordination to something that is much deeper, in a deeper integration. And this is needed to try to tackle big crises as climate change. And how to leverage the role of the research infrastructure in this context is very important. How to leverage this? First of all, I will say that we need to use and to continue to promote open science. Open science for research infrastructures means open data, to provide access to data from the different areas and different disciplines, and also to provide open access to the facilities. Open science is the paradigm. but we can promote this kind of collaboration in order to support open science and also to be sure that we have the proper critical mass to tackle this kind of crisis. We have this mechanism that is the new program, that is the Horizon Europe, is the EU funding mechanism for which includes also the mechanism of funding the Arise in the period 2021-2027. And it's also this is much more impact oriented. I mean, we have learned something from the current crisis, and I think that now it's time to put some resources in order to be sure that we can have the Arise that are much more oriented to produce services and to resources to accelerate the transitions towards a green and digital future. And also to be sure that this kind of effort can be used really to put the science at the service of the society, because this is a critical aspect. As I said, the priorities are the open science and digital transformation that we have also at the national level, together with the Green Deal, health, climate change, and all the related risks. I'm not saying that everything is done. We are not yet there. But the leverage instruments have been developed at EU, at the member states level already. And what the COVID-19 pandemic has demonstrated is the enormous potential capacity of SVRIs to respond to emergencies. They were ready in many cases to go rapidly back to quasi-normal operation, to deliver ad hoc new services, to support research related to COVID, but also to develop new methods, for example, for providing access in the remote access mode, and showing the capacity of working together in a complementary manner. So I think that the cooperation is assured in this way, and this is the way how we can really tackle, hopefully, the next crisis. We expect to have big impacts related, for example, to climate change. There are something that we cannot foresee, but there are things that we expect already.
So this is a very interesting contribution from the European Union side of things. Let me just ask you. You've hinted at this with the new funding patterns for Horizon Europe, but what kind of funding models do you think should be considered to address future crises? How could the mandates and incentives, from funding organizations be changed?
Yeah, it's a very good question. It's not so easy to answer. I would say that for big crises, you need to move big critical mass of scientists to work together, and you cannot do it with small peanuts. You need to have a coordinated program. So this is what we are trying to do in Europe with Horizon Europe, where we have this kind of new services trying to tackle this kind of, for example, there are specific call which are related to climate change risks on the environment and something like that. But this is also not enough, because what you need is also to be sure that there is the proper synergy between what we are doing at European level and what we can do at the national level. So the new program is trying to be aligned with the program of the different member states. And it's also important to consider that in most of the national funding programs is also considered something which is related to the impact on the local scale. And this is also important, because then you can move big mass of experts and scientists, because you can use in synergy the European funding, but also the national funding and the regional funding. And in Europe, after the COVID-19, we have this recovery plan, which is also something that goes in this direction, also at the national level, in particular to respond to, adaptation, mitigation of climate change, to restore the biodiversity, to really be sure that we can do something for the environment. At the same time, also to improve a lot the science in all the different aspects related to medicine, not only the COVID-19, because we don't know what can happen in the future.
Okay, so we just have a few minutes left here, but let me ask you this question. It's very interesting in that European context, the alignment between national, the European, and then of course there's wider than Europe. But what role do informal social relationships play in managing a global crisis?
I mean, it's a difficult question, because I would say that in principle, informal social helps for many things, because you know the people, you start to trust the people, you talk with the people. In the last almost 2 years, we were forced to talk with the people only by video, as we are doing at the moment. So it's there is not so much social life around. But I would say that, of course, conferences help. I think that is also important to consider a specific workshop around a specific theme, for example. And I will also put probably the most important, I mean, based on the experience that we have had for the COVID-19 pandemic, is that also to work together as a scientific community, trying to convey the proper message to the public, to the social media. There is a lot of work to be done in this case, and I would say that not everybody was completely ready to do that. We were really under pressure, and the idea to work together, to prepare, really to try to be consistent with the message, because in our society, in the science community, we can debate, we can discuss. When you pass a message so critical to the public, you need to be clear. And so I think that this was a very good exercise, and I hope, I would not say hopefully, but I'm afraid that this can happen in the future again. So we still have to learn how to do it better. And so such kind of workshop where we can really try to disseminate such kind of things to the public and to use better the social media, I would say, I think this is very important. And I hope that in the next future, we will start soon again to meet all together, probably not so often as in the past, because we have also learned that probably we were traveling too much. And also I work for the environment, so we need also to consider that probably it's not so much efficient for our planet that we take these flights every day to go everywhere, sometimes only for 2 hours meeting. So probably the new world will be a little bit different. And but the social part should be kept. I think it's important.
Okay, I think that's a really important way to frame things. And thank you for this.
Thanks to you.
Well, Mark Thompson, how would you like to weigh in on this question about how research collaborations can be used to address predictable future crises? And how can we leverage these collaborations? If we're thinking in terms of things like climate change, things we know are out there.
Yeah, it's a very good question. I'm never sure about the predictability of future crises, as we've just discovered. I think there are a number of points here. Certainly, firstly, in terms of our big research infrastructures and the multidisciplinary collaborations they enable. Let's take climate change for an example. Looking at all of the ways that we try to get to some form of net zero on a timescale that's necessary, they use technologies we do not have at the moment. It's quite clear we don't have those technologies. So to get there, we are going to have to develop those technologies. And both into, let's take advanced materials, for example, are tackling some of the problems around climate change. So I think our top end big infrastructures and our big facilities and the groups that come together around those facilities are absolutely critical to actually address those technological challenges. And I think that's really what we do with the big infrastructure, our big research infrastructures. They are very much the top of the pyramid of all of the research ecosystem. But when you're particularly pushing technologies beyond the current limit, you need those cutting edge facilities. So where I'm sitting today, sadly not in Canada, I'm actually sitting opposite the diamond light source synchrotron, which I can see out of my window. And that's a really good example of tackling that has been used to tackle the current crisis, where again, because it's right at the cutting edge, you can do stuff you cannot do at other facilities. So some of the understanding of the really detailed structural biology and the understanding of the spike protein and what it looks like in reality and how the different mutations change the binding to the ACE2 receptors on cells, that work is really enabled by this cutting, as I say, these cutting edge capabilities provided by these infrastructures. And huge teams of scientists have come around these facilities to actually then come together and really directly, tackle a very real problem, an ongoing problem. So I see our research infrastructures, particularly the top end, as absolutely critical to addressing the real challenges, the really difficult technological or scientific challenges that we will need to address future crises.
Okay, and so that's not just long-term predictable, that's also, as you said, the acute crises that we faced right now, or have faced right now.
Yeah.
And having that in, so is there something different between then the challenges that the long-term and the acute raise for us, or is this one and the same?
I think that's a really interesting question. I'm not sure I have a good answer to that. I think for the long-term challenges, again, climate change, I think, is a really, really good example. In some sense, there's a program of work. What technologies do we need to develop to address the challenges of climate change and reduce carbon emissions? And you can plan long-term a program of work and bring people together around that program. Now, I think what's happened for the acute crises, and it's really interesting, you have those collaborations there in place already. So the people know each other because they've been working on related topics previously, and they've been collaborating. And suddenly, when an acute issue comes up, such as the coronavirus pandemic, they can pivot very, very quickly. So it's not just about the infrastructures, but it is about the collaborations those infrastructures enable. The people are already connected, and then suddenly there's a new problem, and they know how to work together very, very effectively. So in some sense, the work you do on these longer term predictable challenges, I think, lays the ground actually for the unexpected. Hopefully we won't have too many unexpecteds in the future, but I think that's the other aspect, is that existing collaborations, that they're ready to go. They know how to work together and work incredibly effectively. And it's multidisciplinary as well. It's pretty much all of this stuff we're doing is not single discipline.
So then one form of pandemic preparedness, if I take that a step further, is making sure we have spent the money to put in place the kind of facilities whose need may arise all of a sudden.
Yeah, I think that's right. So it's it's a question of having both, at national level and internationally and globally, obviously, is having that right portfolio of facilities, that we have different capabilities in different places. Or, for example, synchrotrons are a really good example where they address many problems, both in biology but in material science. And there are a number of those around the world now, really at the cutting edge. And making sure we maintain that capability and effectively upgrade that capability as new technologies come along, so we're in the best possible place. We have the best tools in our armory to address the unforeseen. And as I think it's a really interesting question in the area I work, which it tends to be the big physics facilities, although the research they do is not physics. Things like synchrotrons or neutron sources. You want to have a portfolio. So it's no good just having made, everybody if everybody around the world has a synchrotron and nobody has advanced neutron sources, then there's science you cannot do. And I think that's where the international collaboration to ensure globally we have the right tools, and we don't all just copy each other. It's a question that often, we often consider, it's invest nationally or invest internationally. That's always a tough one, but having that broad portfolio is absolutely critical.
So then if we look more at the funding models, what kind of incentives or mandates do we give funders relative to what they might need to change to keep us prepared for these future crises?
Yeah, so it's a really hard question. Yeah, as you know. I think the challenges, I would say, that, just speaking from experience, the challenges we face, it's not the way we fund things. I don't think that's the issue. It's having that long-term planning. So for example, in the UK, we have recently, for the first time, in fact, developed a UK cross-disciplinary roadmap for research infrastructures. So this is very broad, very long-term. It's a really exciting plan. This is a slightly different way of doing it from the UK, where what has happened in the past, it's been a number of one-off investments. And we're trying to move now to a more strategic and coherent approach. Now, the real challenge for that is not at the funder level, it's really at the government level, which provides the flow of money into the funding agencies. And of course, governments change, and governments' timescales for making commitments to funding can be quite short term, and nothing wrong with that. That's the way it actually has to be. But that doesn't necessarily provide that long-term stability. And without that long-term stability, almost knowing roughly what resources you have available in 10 years' time, it's actually quite hard to plan for these projects which are going to take 10 to 15 years from conception to actually delivering science. So for me, I think that's the biggest challenge. It's not the way the funding agencies fund things. It's actually the long-term, the difficulty in long-term planning, just because of the uncertainties around national budgets, long-term governmental budgets. And again, it's good examples. Obviously, are we've been trying to put long-term plans in place, and then COVID comes along, and all of our economies are not in such a good place as they were before, and that has made it difficult for governments to plan longer term. So yeah, so that's where I would see the challenges. I think if we have the ability to plan long term with a reasonable degree of certainty that there's going to be some flow of money, that will make all of the difference. And as I say, in the UK, with the formation of UK Research and Innovation, that's one of the things we're trying to move the dial on, move away from one-off investments to this is a portfolio of infrastructure investments we want to make across all disciplines, and that's not just science. In fact, that includes the arts and humanities. So we're being very, very broad. I hope we can pull this off and actually turn that into a program that we deliver, because I think that will have real long-term benefits for the UK.
Well, I find that very interesting, because you've hooked funding to strategic planning, and they're not always fully hooked. I heard recently from a former, now retired, very good government bureaucrat in Canada, that 20 years ago, it was primarily the UK and France that were willing to do strategic planning. And now there are 20-some nations that do it. And I don't think my own is exactly there yet. And how to base that on your strengths and what place you need to have in the world, as opposed to where equipment or facilities exist elsewhere. So I think there's a very real and interesting process that could be undertaken if one wanted to do it at not only at a national level, but at a more global level as well.
I think that's an interesting point. So, in considering our portfolio of infrastructures we want to invest in, it's not just national. So in some cases, it may be we want to be part of this larger international collaboration to tackle an area of science where either it's not possible to do it nationally, or it makes more financial sense to collaborate with partners across the globe. So it's a very broad, the way, our approach is a very broad portfolio approach that we are trying to balance, in fact, across disciplines, across physical and data infrastructures, and also looking at national and international investments.
So because you come from, you're involved in an agency that undergirds infrastructure in your country, I'm going to ask you a question that is very specific to you, which is, do you think that data is infrastructure?
Yeah, absolutely. Indeed. So really good example of the kind of things in our, so in our infrastructure thinking, we produced wasn't really a roadmap because we didn't have funding to attach it to, so you can't really have a roadmap without knowing what envelope you're fitting in. But it was basically a document that covered where we felt all the opportunities were to invest. Some of those opportunities were data infrastructures. So these are kind of type, for example, social surveys, the data that comes out of social surveys, or medical data. This is valuable data, and if you have the right infrastructures, there's the opportunity even to link those data sets up and actually effectively learn more, extract more information from the data. So absolutely. So we use a rather clumsy phrase, digital research infrastructure, but the infrastructure that supports data is important, as is actually the gathering of the data in some of these cases. So yeah, absolutely. Another example in terms of the arts and humanities, really good example, is digitization of our museum collections. So we are fortunate enough in the UK, or for various reasons, historical reasons, to actually have really fantastic collections in our museums. And actually digitizing that data and making it available for wider research is really, really important. So yeah, we absolutely, we set out to do that right from day one, in fact.
That's a wonderful example, and different than what, you do have a real possibility there in your country. So if I turn to how we create resilient organizations for collaboration, what do you think are the magic ingredients, whether they're technical or social?
Yes, I mean, so I think the challenges we find most around the organization and structuring of our kind of research infrastructures, it's mostly around people. Because these are technically, whatever it is, whether it's computational infrastructure or big physical infrastructure, you need highly skilled people to operate the infrastructure and to extract the best out of it. And I'm not sure what it's like in, let's say, for example, Canada, but there's a real challenge at the moment of finding the people with the right skills. And these typically are focused on the more engineering and technical skills rather than the scientific side, which are absolutely critical to running these infrastructures. So there's a big issue around training and ensuring we have the right pool of people, not just for our research, but actually for the wider economy. And that is definitely a challenge we feel quite acutely. It's a challenge we face with many of our big research infrastructures. Actually, is getting the particularly engineers and people with that real deep computational expertise. So that for me is the biggest challenge. And one of the things we're looking to do, we're looking to see how we might be able to use our research infrastructures to train people, not to keep them within our research pool, but actually for most of them to go out into industry. Although we'll hopefully keep a few. But actually trying to make that a broader part of our mission around our physical infrastructure. But for me, that really is the biggest challenge, actually. And it's typically not the scientists. The scientists. There's a large pool of scientists. They know how to collaborate. They work very effectively together. So those collaborations grow organically. but they need that technical support there to really be able to, you know, as I say, access the facilities and do the best science.
Okay, since you mentioned this strategic planning, let me take you back to decision making about that decision making that facilitates collaboration to make sure that we make the best possible decisions that ensure public interest. So what does this have to be like, not only nationally and internationally?
Yeah, I think it's very hard, I think. So nationally, I think the step that we made, it was only 3 years ago, was really a commitment to move to try and do something more coherent in the UK as the UK Research and Innovation. And that triggered a huge amount of community engagement. You want to learn from the experts, the people who know or think they know what they want. So there's a big process of community engagement. And we're kind of lucky in the UK now that we've moved to this, I won't call it a federated system, but we have a single organisation, UK Research and Innovation, under which sit the disciplinary research councils, of which Science and Technology Facilities Council is one of those. So we all did our internal consultation with the communities, but we then came together as the research councils to actually look across the whole range and work to actually pick out the areas we felt had the broadest support, the biggest likelihood of impact. And then we developed those ideas into something that they're not quite at the point where you would invest money in them, but they're sufficiently well developed that you kind of understand the costs of what it would look like to actually implement it and understand whether you can. And then we had this commitment to come up with a portfolio of potential investments. And that's kind of the stage where we are at now. So it's, and again, building on independent advice. But I think the thing that's really the key thing that's made a difference is doing it coherently, rather than one, you know, just say what does one particular area want. Yeah. Internationally is very much harder, I think, because from experience, a lot of the developments of international infrastructures is there's a lot of politics that will come into that, and that's fine. But it's a different process. There are different reasons to collaborate internationally.
Okay, I find that very interesting. I think this coherence across your if I can call it system, funding system is probably very interesting for us who don't yet have a single unified one like you do. So thank you very much. You've given some very interesting things for us all to think about. And I need to say to our audience that this session is not followed by a live question and answer period. I've had the privilege of asking all the questions, and we've had wonderful people providing great answers to us. So we'll have to leave it at that and wish you all well and good health, and that we'll see you in person in the future.